Joe, when you look at how Zelensky was treated in this NATO summit, comparing to his address to Congress in December 2022, what would be your conclusion on this issue?
I think we saw with Zelensky's tweet soon after his meeting in Vilnius that he's extremely frustrated. He wanted more substantive promises or clear indications of a timeline when Ukraine can enter NATO, and perhaps more commitments as far as weapons and so forth. But the truth is, and as Joe Biden himself has admitted, the West itself is running out of ammo to give to Ukraine. And now they're at this frustrated, this level of frustration where they're going to do, the release of cluster bombs, cluster weapons, which has been found illegal all across the world. So it puts Biden and the United States in a sort of a morally compromised position that they're willing to go to this length to keep this war going. And I think that, so I think there's frustration at the same time that there's still sentiment in the White House and elsewhere to keep this thing going, this war going at least until the elections next year.
Do you think that this war gonna end this year, or it's gonna get longer?
Well, I think there's a part of the Biden White House that wants it to keep going, at least through the elections, because it would be such an embarrassment to Joe Biden and his administration to admit this is a failed effort. However, Ukraine is clearly losing this war, maybe even has lost this war, and they're out of weapons themselves. They've lost, some estimates are as many as 200,000 soldiers on the field, and so what's left? I don't know. We've talked about F-16s, and that was cluster bombs and so forth. What cluster bombs are not going to work either, from the military expertise that I've been listening to. And so, what comes after that? Do we then resort to nuclear weapons or what have you? I tell you, it's at a level where I don't think the military capacity is there. The political end of it wants it to keep going, but I don't know that militarily it can.
But you see that Macron yesterday said that he's going to send long-range missiles to Ukraine. You see, they're not going to give up on this, sending money, sending weapons, and there is a tremendous amount of corruption in Ukraine, and we have these riots in Europe, in France. Nobody knows if these weapons gonna get into the hand of these people in France. What's your take on this?
What we're seeing here is, in some ways, a huge struggle over the concept of neoliberalism, the sort of world rule of corporatized governments, and that basically seeks the profits of those corporations and so forth, and the governments that support them. The neoliberalism, the opening of all kind of trade venues at the higher corporate level, but then punish people at the lower level, has led to this massive migration across the world. And there's frustration now. We see this in France, these demonstrations and so forth. France, the demonstrations now, they came earlier with the issue over the retirement age and so forth. There's so much upheaval. There are demonstrations too in Germany. We're not hearing as much about it, but they're out there. There's frustration all around. These governments, Macron, Schultz in Germany and so forth, they all feel, in many ways, the pressure that Biden feels, like they put themselves on the line for this war in Ukraine. And to back off right now means to admit failure and thus perhaps the end of their own administrations. So they've got to keep promising weapons. They've got to keep pledging support and so forth and so on, even though their own munitions factories are running out. And so it's frustration. It's also there in many ways. I don't know. It could be the last stand of the neoliberal world rule in a way, because the pressures are coming in from all ends. This war in Ukraine is a losing prospect for the West. Russia is getting stronger. It's not getting weaker. It's getting stronger. And if we're running out of weapons to send to Ukraine, what does it say about our own munitions, our own sort of weaponry and our ability to fight a war? And so, yes, you're seeing the promises come up, but it's all from a political perspective rather than a realistically military perspective.
In this summit, Stoltenberg said if Ukraine want to be part of NATO, they have to win this war in Ukraine. Is there any possibility to Ukraine winning this war, or what's your take if Ukraine, in your opinion, can Ukraine get the NATO membership?
Ukraine cannot win this war. Ukraine, in many ways, has already lost this war. As far as NATO membership goes, there's sentiment for that, but the NATO members know, the United States knows, Joe Biden knows, Schultz, Macron, all of them know. As soon as it becomes a NATO member, then we're in World War III because of Article 5 of the NATO, Constitution, what have you. And so they would all have to go to war with Russia. Who wants that? I mean, that's so. There are elements, I think, within the so-called deep state within Washington, D.C., and I'm a former Washington, D.C. reporter. I was up there for a number of years, that perhaps would even consider a war with Russia, even a nuclear war, thinking that we're so much superior and what have you that we'd win and it'd ever be over quickly, or that Putin's bluffing and wouldn't engage, would back off or so forth. But it's just crazy to gamble like that. It is so irresponsible. But you have people like Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, others who were so anti-Russian, so Russophobe, that they would even consider something like that rather than admitting defeat. And look at what the deep state has done as far as the United States goes. It's been one defeat after another. Vietnam was a defeat. Afghanistan, Iraq. Look at the death and destruction has been left in the path of American intervention. And the same sort of voices have pushed those conflicts, just as they're pushing the conflict now in Ukraine. And when a reasonable voice is going to be raised to say, okay, at some point this has got to stop. And where is the push for peace? You are hearing that from some of the alternative candidates like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and others. I think there's growing backing for those candidates, which really upsets the Democratic Party establishment. And I think perhaps getting beyond your question here, but I think that Trump's election, when Trump was elected president, it shook the deep state, the establishment in Washington, D.C., that they vowed they can never countenance that again. That's one reason for all the legal pursuit of Trump on a variety of ways, because for one thing, perhaps more than any other, Trump has been open to dialogue with our so-called enemies, with at least with Russia, with North Korea, perhaps not China as much, but it's certainly with Russia. And that just goes against the grain of a lot of the institutional thinking in Washington.
He said, Trump, in his last town hall with CNN, he said that he's not willing to go to war with China as well. He's willing to compete with China economically, but he's not considering war with China as well. But still, he's getting hit. They were hitting Trump as much as possible.
Well, that's true. Trump was always, being very critical of China during his administration and so forth. But Trump is a businessman, and as a businessman, that's what he's thinking, not necessarily thinking war. And I mean, there's a story that in which Trump, I think, and Barack Obama were talking, and says, "What have you ever talked to the North Korean leader?" And then Obama's response was, "Well, he's a dictator." And Trump says, "Well, you can at least talk to him. Let's find out what a conversation would bring." And that's so that's the sort of businessman in Trump talking. And I'm not a Trump supporter, and I'm critical of him in many of his policies. But I'm impressed by. I think in many ways on a foreign policy level, is much more successful than the disastrous Biden administration.
If you compare, if how can we assess Donald Trump? He had 4 years of his presidency. He did nothing to the war. He started no war. He tried to make a negotiation between Arab states and Israel. What he did was amazing, was really amazing in his foreign policy, but they're not liking that.
No,
The, the,
they don't like that. And
why the mainstream media hates him so much?
oh my gosh, don't get me. Well, you're going to get me started on the mainstream media. I'm a lifelong journalist. I've been a professor of journalism at the University of Mississippi for over 30 years. I was and practicing journalism during that time, and then also a journalist in Washington and elsewhere. And I've written about international issues. I've published 2 books on it. Anyway, I am just aghast at the performance of the mainstream media since this war in Ukraine began. It's the mainstream media has become a voice for the Biden Democratic Party establishment, and will not countenance any sort of reasonable look at Trump's foreign policy and those attitudes toward Russia and other countries, because it's Trump, and I think that it's been an eye-opening experience how the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, all the major news networks and so forth are basically just echoing the policies of the administration. And rather than questioning the results of those policies, I mean, the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines, Seymour Hersh's report that the United States was behind this, totally ignored by the New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth. Here's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who exposes that complicity of the United States in what is actually an act of war, not only against Russia, but against Germany, our own ally, and not reporting that. And just ignoring that Hersh report. It's just, it's mind-boggling. It is. You have to go to alternative media like we're doing right now, and to hear varying outlooks and opinions about these things. And that is, for me, as a professor of journalism, as a journalist, has been very frustrating and very disappointing.
John Mearsheimer, in his book Why Leaders Lie, he argues that leaders in their foreign policy, they rarely lie. But if you consider the case of the US, you see that Putin was warning the US leaders since 2007 in Munich. He was telling, no, this NATO expansion not gonna end well for anybody. How he actually, when we look at what he was telling us in this period of time, since in 2007 until 2021, he sent in December 2021, sent 2 letters to negotiate again in Minsk 1, Minsk 2, 2014, 2015. He tried to negotiate. We lost all those opportunities. And in your opinion, why the US leaders are so eager to lie so blatantly?
Well, in the United States, and really beyond the United States, as Dwight D. Eisenhower told us many years ago, there's the military-industrial complex, the huge munitions factories that's producing and supporting and pushing war around the world. It does not want peace; it wants war. When in 1990, when Russia under Gorbachev or the Soviet Union agreed to Germany coming together again, East and West Germany, and to the Soviet Union pulling out hundreds of thousands of troops on the promise from the West that NATO would not expand to the East. We gave him that promise, and we broke that promise again and again and again until now. NATO is up and down the Russian borders, and wants to ultimately include, I guess, Ukraine. Russia and Western diplomats, Western experts and what have you knew that this was, Russia could not stand this, particularly Ukraine, cannot count, that we wouldn't want it. We didn't want it in Cuba back in 1962, and Russia doesn't want an armed anti-Russian, pro-NATO Ukraine on its border either. And but we've broken those promises because I think there's a certain cynicism, there's a certain just anti-Russian feeling. I guess it goes all the way back to the Cold War, almost like a visceral hatred of Russia that kind of goes beyond reason. And it is hard to explain how this has evolved over the years, but a kind of a cynicism that has allowed the West, particularly those in the United States, to break promises with impunity and to do this and not be sorry that they did it and have no sort of a commitment to their own integrity in the diplomatic process. And it's just it's kind of beyond logic, and it's led to the current tragedy in which Ukraine is now we have another sort of sacrificial lamb in this battle between the West and the East.
And when you see this NATO expansion to Ukraine, to Georgia, as Brzezinski put it, they want to surround Russia in Black Sea. Do you think that was the end game for NATO?
The end game, I think, is beyond that, is to ultimately regime change, to get Putin kicked out, get a friendly leader in there, and then ultimately to break up Russia, to break up into so many federations that could then be exploited by Western corporate interests. Those corporate interests are the backers of the current administration. They're the backers of both the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. They want those markets. They don't want Russia in the way, because then they want to get to China, which is an even bigger enemy, and one that they want to really sort of remove from the international, from any kind of sort of semblance of international economic dominance. And so that's their long-term game plan. It doesn't even end with Russia. It goes on then to China.
When you see that the United States, this military-industrial complex, cannot afford the level of ammunition that gonna get, they can't afford this war in Ukraine. And I recently there was an interview with the former contractor of this industrial complex. He said that some little things, just like a screw that for a weapon that can it costs few bucks, but when it comes out it's $11,000.
Yeah.
You see the level of corruption in this process. They can produce enough ammunition and they make a lot of money out of this.
Yeah, it's we've talked about the corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine was named the most corrupt country in Europe, and perhaps beyond Europe, even before this war began. And we still don't know the full length of the role of Hunter Biden and Joe Biden in Ukraine. But it all is part of a larger sort of stage of corruption that the military-industrial complex is very much part of. I mean, we in this country, we have so many internal problems, homelessness, growing, daily in our major cities, the trouble on the border with immigrants wanting to come in and so forth, rising inflation, many people having 2 or 3 jobs just to survive and what have you. And yet we're able to pump billions and billions and billions of dollars into that complex, and right now into Ukraine alone. And we're still with very little oversight. What happens to this money? There have been reports that less than 30% of the money that we sent actually ends up supporting the military in Ukraine. Where does the rest of it go? Are we going to find this in terrorist camps around the world, what have you, in future years? I mean, it's been the same thing in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. already there's talk of what's going to happen after the war, the rebuilding of Ukraine. There's already been companies that have been named that are going to be part of that rebuilding. They're as corrupt as anything as well, and the same kind of corruption there is going to take place as took place certainly in Iraq and other countries.
Do you think that Russia going to give up this land that they got from Ukraine?
No, they're going to. Okay, it's hard to predict. What's going to take place maybe a year from now or what have you. I think that Putin is a very smart politician. You don't stay in power 20 years in the Kremlin and not be really a smart guy. And he knows that he's going to know there's got to be some sort of a out game for the West in a way where they can at least save some face. And what will that be? I'm not really sure, but they've already incorporated the Donbass, Crimea into Russia. That's part of Russia now. It's not going to go back. And so that's going to be a concession that the West is going to have to make if they're going to be at the negotiating table. Beyond that, what kind of deal can they come up with so that the West is not totally embarrassed? I think Putin would be sensitive to that. But at the same time, he's not going to, after all this death and destruction, he's not going to relinquish those territories back to you. Ukraine has lost eastern Ukraine. And, in many ways, it never considered that truly a part of Ukraine anyway. I mean, that was the industrial part of Ukraine, so it's very valuable and everything. But the Russian-speaking, culturally Russian people of eastern Ukraine have always been on the outside. And that's why the Ukraine government has been bombing them since 2014, and which is one of the reasons that Russia entered the special military operation.
You think that beside invading Ukraine in February 2022, was there any option left for Putin in those days?
There are some thinkers who will say, yes, Putin had other options. He could have just built up that military as strong as possible along the border and just sort of let it stay there and say, okay, what's going to happen next, and just see what happens next or whatever. But I tell you what, you've got to remember too, this has been going on, the bombing of the Donbass region, whatever, has been going on since 2014. Thousands and thousands of people were killed in a cynical bombing of civilian areas by the Ukraine government. The assertion by Putin and others in the Russian government that the Ukraine government was riddled with pro-Nazi, neo-Nazi elements is absolutely true. And the Western media used to acknowledge that. The Azov Battalion and so forth. These are neo-Nazis. That in the Russian mind, I can imagine that brings back so many bitter memories of World War II and the horrific loss of the Russian people to the Nazi invaders. Of course, Russia ultimately defeated those invaders, what have you, but those memories are still strong. And then to sort of to allow such a government to continue to exist on this border in a hostile way and to continue killing culturally Russian people in eastern Ukraine, I think Putin figured out, had decided he had done everything he could to prevent this. Now it's just got to happen, But others disagree. What those other options might have been, I don't know, because the West was not going to back off. It was not going to back off. So something had to be done.
When you see the number of troops he used in February, something like 100,000 troops, he went into Ukraine. He was, in my opinion, he was trying to show his seriousness in this war. He was trying to make a negotiation out of this movement. In March, he tried to make some agreements with Ukrainians in Istanbul, in Turkey, but he couldn't do anything. Why those talks failed, in your opinion?
Because the West didn't want those talks to succeed. Andrea Merkel in Germany admitted that the Minsk agreements were really a bogus agreement on the part of the West, just to give Ukraine time to arm itself for, further and what have you, for a potential future confrontation with Russia. So there was cynicism on the Western part, even in signing those agreements, not a real intention to live up to those agreements. I think Putin realized that. He said, I can't trust these people. They'll sign a piece of paper and then not follow up on it. This has been a year in and year out, they've done this. And at one point, as you're absolutely correct, I think even Zelensky and what have you was willing to sort of sit down at a table and work out an agreement. But here comes Boris Johnson out of England and says, no, you can't sign anything. You can't sign this agreement. You can't sign any kind of peace treaty at this point. We got to see this thing through to the end. And so, so the West has had plenty of chances, and now they've seen the results of not taking advantage of those opportunities that they had earlier, because now they're not going to get the Donbass back. They're not going to get Crimea back. I don't know what they think they can do about it, but they're not.
And look at how many people were killed in this war.
I know. It's awful. And I think that, I've had students from Ukraine, and I just feel such compassion for them because, every Ukrainian family has been by now been touched by this war, and all the senseless deaths. I mean, I think the politicization of even the military conflict, the decision by the Kiev government to hold on to Bakhmut as long as possible, no matter what losses are incurred, and then ultimately to lose that city. And it's been a bloodbath in many ways, and the Ukrainian government is to blame for it.
You see that you talk about those agreements that they were on in Istanbul, and Zelensky was willing to do those agreements. But what was the mindset of the West? They were thinking that Ukraine can fight Russia, can win this war, or they just would be satisfied with just bleeding Russia, just harming Russia as much as possible.
There is a body of thought in the political circles of the deep state in Washington, D.C., that Russia ultimately is weak, that Russia is a huge gas station and little more, and that it can't, it's big and what have you, but it really cannot sustain any kind of sort of serious war. That's been proven wrong. And, there's a tradition certainly in Washington, D.C., not to really know your enemy, not to really learn about your opponent, whether it's economic or political. What did we know about the culture of Vietnam, its own history, and entering that war, and are the complexities of that history? The same with Iraq and Afghanistan. And to sort of just think we can just bully our way in and everything's just, the enemy's just going to fall apart or something. That's been a thing of repetition over the years in all these wars. We've not really taken the time to understand the other side and their motivations. Sending those troops initially at the beginning of this military operation to into Ukraine, Russia doing this, and to Kiev, I don't really think there was an intention to destroy Kiev and sort of end this war, because Kiev is important. And I'm saying Kiev. That's what I've always said. And now that you say Kiev, Kiev. But Kiev is extremely important in the cultural history of Russia. It's in a very important city, and there's not it may end up having to be that way if the West pursues it, continues to pursue it. But I don't think the Russian military wanted to destroy Kiev. I think it could have been a tactical move or what have you, a variety of reasons for why they did what they did. And I think you're right that it took Putin a while to realize that he was not going to get any sort of true, honest agreement with the West unless the troops went in with a serious intent of winning this war.
And in your opinion, how we can end this war? Is in Biden administration, do you see any potential possibility for agreement with Russia?
Uh, I've always said I'm the last optimist in the room, but I'm not feeling too optimistic right now. And I think that you've got now cross currents of a serious military disaster for the Ukraine and the West unfolding on the battlefield, but that's coming at the same time as huge presidential election is heating up here in the United States. Joe Biden can't even imagine trying to go on and win this presidency if he's handed a huge loss in Ukraine after committing all these billions of dollars and so forth and all these promises and everything. I think Macron feels vulnerable. I think Schultz too in Germany, other leaders. Look at Europe and the chaos that has ensued since this war began. I mean, the shifting governments in Italy and England several times. More recently in was in the Netherlands or in Denmark, and then Germany itself too, and then Macron I think is increasingly vulnerable in France, and those leaders know that too. If this war ends on their watch with a total defeat of Ukraine, they're going to be held responsible. And that's going to be the death knell, perhaps, to their political careers. So there's desperation, and that's kind of scary when you've got politically powerful leaders, and you've got the nuclear war potentially looming, and then you've got them desperate. That's kind of scary. I'm hoping that reason will prevail, and that somehow an off-ramp will be found that where they can somehow feel like they've saved face. At the same time, they've overseen a horrible defeat on their part. I'm hoping for that, but it's hard to sort of envision how that's going to unfold right now. Certainly for me, it is.
You see, this is not the only front for the US. You have the other one in Taiwan, the conflict between China and United States. How do you see the US policy in Taiwan? How does it
Yeah.
work for the US?
I think it was just awful diplomacy for Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to go to Taiwan last year. Just the then for the White House to send Blinken over to meet with the Chinese leader Xi, and then Biden later, like 2 days later, calling Xi a dictator. It's just it is such it's just horrible way to deal with world relations with an important economic power like China. All this is about economic power and the desire of corporate America to extend its power over Asia. What is China doing that's really in any way truly militarily threatening to the United States? Why should the United States be in the South China Sea and not China? I mean, my gosh, and what are our interests on the other side of the world over there that makes us look at China as this enemy? China has always claimed since the Chinese Revolution in 1949 that Taiwan belongs to China. And the United States has agreed with that, and has agreed in treaty after treaty and whatever. And yet, are we truly willing to go to war with China over Taiwan when we actually agree that Taiwan is part of mainland China? I think ultimately has nothing to do with military competition. It's all economic competition, and there are some signs, but you don't know how seriously to take them, that perhaps the United States might want to back off this belligerent attitude a little bit, Blinken's visit and so forth, others in the administration. But, one thing you don't know with President Biden, I mean, how much is he really in control of things in the White House? Who are the people whispering in his ear and who truly control things? And those are the people we're not sure who all they are. There's Newland, there's others, but what are their feelings about this, and how far are they going to take it? But I do think that Russia, this whole war with Russia is just kind of is a step toward a larger war with China, or at least a larger confrontation with China, which is ultimately, what they're looking toward.
How this war in Ukraine contributed to the de-dollarization. You see, in China had made an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. You see, Syria was accepted in Arab leagues. You see, these are great changes in that region. How does it affect the power of the U.S.?
Absolutely. The rise of the so-called BRIC nations, which as an alternative to the Western dominance, Western hegemony over the economic hegemony over the world, I think it's an exciting thing to see. And because this is a challenge to the neoliberal control of the world that I mentioned earlier. And it's a rightful challenge. That neoliberal sort of construct is beginning to fall apart. This is all connected to the massive demonstrations we're seeing in France. The frustrations of migrants who've come over, many forced to come over because neoliberal policies destroyed their economic potential at home. So they had to come across into nations where they could perhaps get work. But the rise of the so-called BRIC nations, and that's like you said, it's Brazil, it's Russia, it's China, India, and so forth. This is a serious challenge to dollar dominance in the world, and I think this is part of the fear that's perhaps motivating, at least in part, this confrontation with China over Taiwan and so forth. What does this all mean ultimately for the whole sort of corporate regime that we still envision or still see, at least in Washington, that should be the rightful rulers of the world economically,
And let's talk about this presidential election 2024. We have RFK Jr. This is the man of peace, man of logic. How do you see his chance in this election?
This is really very interesting, very scary for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has thrown all its power behind Joe Biden. The campaign says it does not want debates. It's going to limit any kind of sort of public sort of appearance by Biden in which he may have to face a lot of questions from reporters and so forth. They've got sort of Biden in a cocoon, so he's not going to be challenged or whatever. But at the same time, this growing restiveness. We saw it before Robert Kennedy Jr. came on the scene with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders gave a strong sort of challenge to the Democratic establishment. And, that all goes back to so-called Russiagate, in which supposedly Russia was trying to undermine the candidacy of Hillary Clinton by leaking information that the Democratic Party was trying to undermine actually Bernie Sanders. I wrote at the time, I said, if the Russians released that information, more power to them. We needed to know this. But, who knows who ultimately was the source of that information. But then it launched the whole sort of Russiagate scandal, which ended up being bogus and bogus accusations that Trump was colluding with the Russians and so forth. All these things are indicating a sort of a circling of the wagons by the Democratic Party establishment to close anyone out who's going to challenge their guy, and that's Joe Biden. Robert Kennedy has come on the scene now. He has that name. He's part of the Kennedy family, still a sort of a magical name in American politics. He is making a lot of sense in talking about we need to get out of this war with Russia. We need to deal logically with the problems on the border. We need to get Julian Assange out of prison finally, because the guy was really telling us things we needed to know. And he's making a lot of sense. He's being attacked as this conspiracist because of his comments in the past about the COVID vaccines and so forth. I think even more and more people are starting to listen to that because there's distrust of big pharma, the big pharmaceutical industry in this country, which has gotten such favorable legislation from Congress, all powerful, and people are beginning to raise a lot of the questions that Kennedy even raised back then. I think Kennedy makes a lot of sense, and he's He's raised over $6 million, I think, since the last reporting, reportage of fundraising for the campaign. So, and he's getting up. Well, I think his numbers are now up at least into the 20% percentile or what have you. This is scaring the Democratic Party, and I hope Kennedy watches his back. Because there could be some really dirty dealing going on. Organizations in power are not going to relinquish that power without a struggle. And Kennedy's challenging them right now. If he continues to grow and influence, I don't want how much to say on air here, but I worry about his health, his security. I worry about what have you, and he needs to be aware that that people will do practically anything to preserve power, And I'm not making any kind of accusations or what have you, but he is posing a real challenge, I think.
You see, this movement started with Bernie Sanders and Trump. These guys got votes from both sides of the aisle. They brought down this concept of Republican Democrats
Right.
And now we see this man with he's 64, but I think he's in the new generation of the US politician. I I think that how do you see the possibility of can they make a new party, a third party? Is there any possibility for a third party to survive in the US?
120 or 130 years ago, we had the so-called Populist Party in the United States, which really was the strongest third-party movement in this country's history. They filled legislatures across the country, elected a number of senators and what have you, and they were so popular they forced the Democratic Party to adopt many of their policies in order to stop the challenge. Since then, we've had a number of third-party efforts and what have you. I think the mood right now is as good as it's ever been for a third-party surge. Right now, Kennedy is a Democrat. But I think that what's happened, I'll tell you, it began before Clinton, but Clinton really sealed the coffin in many ways on the Democratic Party's strong connection to working class people. And you had that connection under Franklin Roosevelt. It continued somewhat through the next decades, through Johnson and what have you. Of course, civil rights was a factor in sort of complicating the landscape there. But with Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton came in, and this is the same Bill Clinton who was the head of the United States when NATO broke its promises to Gorbachev about not expanding eastward. Anyway, with Bill Clinton, and then later through his wife Hillary, you see a major shift in the Democratic Party toward identity politics, where the strong allegiance to racial equality. Nothing wrong with that. That's all great and what have you. And now we see with LGBT and so forth, all these things are fine and good, but also just kind of leaving the working class as a whole behind. And what Kennedy has said and what Bernie Sanders said again and again, I'm tired of identifying you as black, as you as brown, as you are gay, what have you. What do we share? What are our common interests, our common goals, our common needs? The Democratic Party has forgotten that. It's lost that connection. Candidates like Kennedy could resurrect that if they can ever break through the wall of the Democratic that's been formed around the Democratic Party establishment. That's what they have to do. Republicans, you've got Trump, who, when he came in, he upset the apple cart because he was not going to listen to the CIA or the FBI or whatever, the whole security establishment, and what they told him about Russia or around the world and what have you. He came in, and that scared the heck out of the Washington establishment. But by and large, the Republican Party is still the party of big business, big corporations, the wealthy, and even Trump himself is still going to be representing that constituency. and so forth. But so the two parties, both now, are really they're corporate control. Both parties. Wall Street is deep in the pockets of both the Democrats and Republicans, and people are more and more aware of that. And so I think when you've got candidates like Robert Kennedy and so forth that that are showing some potential, some possibility, it raises hope that perhaps some other force can come in to break this grip that Wall Street and the corporatocracy has on America, whether it's through a third party or a serious challenge that's going to finally break up one of the existing parties.
Thank you so much, Joe, for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to talk with you here.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I hope we can keep these talks in the near future.
I look forward to it. You take care and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye now.